The island nation's Prime Minister has declared that the country is bankrupt.
Sri Lanka defaults on $51 billion external debt.
The President, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, has now fled the country as Sri Lanka suffers from the worst economic crisis in decades.
In 2021, the Sri Lankan government officially declared the worst economic crisis in the country in 73 years. In August 2021, a food emergency was declared. However, the government denied food shortages. Sri Lanka's Energy Minister, Udaya Gammanpila, acknowledged the crisis could lead to a financial disaster. Now, a state of emergency has been declared, and Sri Lanka's economic crisis is driving millions of people into poverty, jeopardizing their rights to health, education, and an adequate standard of living. Former leader Gotabaya Rajapaksa stepped down last week after fleeing the country as protesters stormed key government buildings in the capital, Colombo. Protests started in the capital in April and spread across the country. Police fired several rounds of tear gas and a military helicopter briefly circled overhead, but the protesters appeared undeterred as violence and political chaos gripped the island nation of 22 million people. Recently, lawmakers elected six-time Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe as Sri Lanka's new president, and the Speaker of the Parliament said Rajapaksa had approved Wickremesinghe's acting as president, invoking a section of the Constitution dealing with times when the president is unable to fulfill his duties. Mass protests erupted in March in response to shortages of food, fuel, and medicines, and other essential items. The situation was compounded by economic reforms such as deep tax cuts and servicing debt payments, which ate into the country's foreign exchange reserves. Let's get into more details about how serious this crisis actually is and how it could be their downfall. But before we get into details, a quick reminder that we have a bonus fact for you towards the end of the video, so stay tuned. Severity of the crisis. The severity of Sri Lanka's economic crisis is evidenced by the fact that the country is being widely pointed to as a textbook case of how an economy should not be managed. The past few months have seen extreme fuel and gas shortages, currency depreciation leading to near hyperinflation, shortages of medicines, and long power cuts largely due to a shortage of foreign exchange. In July, Human Rights Watch interviewed 20 people in Colombo who were struggling to get by on dwindling incomes, with inflation over 50% and some necessities nearly unattainable at times. Those interviewed said that they had cut back and were only eating 2 meals a day and were taking loans to meet basic expenses, such as electricity bills and rent. The United Nations estimates that 5.7 million people in Sri Lanka need humanitarian assistance, with 4.9 million, 22% of the population, being food insecure, meaning they do not have consistent access to adequate nutritious food. Families were already struggling from the pandemic, with 36% reporting reducing their food consumption in a UNICEF survey in late 2020. That number doubled to 70% in a survey conducted in April 2022, just as the economic crisis hit. Others were struggling to buy medicine, which the government previously provided. Following 2 years of disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, schools had to be closed for a month because of fuel shortages and only reopened on July 25th. Although in many cases lessons were provided online, many interviewees said that they could not afford internet access for their children. Reports indicate that many children have been dropping out of school. Economic and debt crisis. Sri Lanka's debt-laden economy has collapsed as it runs out of money to pay for food, fuel, and medicine. The island is relying on help from neighboring India, China, and from International Monetary Fund, IMF. The government owes $51 billion and is unable to make interest payments on its loans. Tourism, an important engine of economic growth, sputtered because of the pandemic. Country's currency has collapsed by 80%, making imports more expensive and worsening inflation. The finance ministry says Sri Lanka has only $25 million in usable foreign reserves and needs $6 billion to stay afloat for 6 months. The result is a country on the edge of bankruptcy, with hardly any money to fulfill the basic needs of its people. The experts said that the snowballing economic and debt crisis was deepened by the government's hasty and botched agricultural transition, adding that the World Food Program, WFP, has launched an emergency response as nearly 62,000 citizens are in need of urgent assistance. The program is expected to cap public spending, including public sector wages, despite the IMF's own guidance acknowledging the public sector wage cuts disproportionately harm women and encourages alternative policies. It may also remove fuel and electricity subsidies and increase value-added or consumption taxes, which would drive up prices when millions are already struggling. The conditions the IMF places on this loan could either exacerbate the political and economic hardship or provide desperately needed relief while addressing underlying causes. The government should ensure that any new tax measures, including those introduced in an IMF program, are progressive and do not risk further eroding economic rights. Measures can include renegotiating contracts with foreign investors that pay little or no taxes, increasing corporate taxes, increasing income taxes for the wealthiest Sri Lankans or wealth tax. Missteps in the past. Many policies of the administration of the former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa led to the aggravation of the economic crisis. The tax cuts given in 2019, when Sri Lanka was already seeing low tax revenues, led to larger fiscal deficits, resulting in international ratings agencies downgrading Sri Lanka, effectively shutting the country out of international capital markets. The COVID-19 pandemic, which led to a fall in tourists and in remittance sent home by Sri Lankans working abroad, further exacerbated the situation. The chemical fertilizer ban was another mistake, as admitted by the former president himself, which led to agriculture output decreasing significantly. Fixing the currency exchange rate at 203 Sri Lankan rupees to the US dollar by using up foreign reserves and deferring engagement with the IMF led the economic crisis to spiral out of control. But a large share of the blame lies in the structural issues of the Sri Lankan economy. Macro risk factors such as a 26-year-long civil war, cultural predispositions against foreign direct investment, public skepticism about privatization, populist policies, and low taxes have all led to where the country is at the moment. Causes of the crisis. In Sri Lanka, just over 1 in 6 of the country's total workforce is employed by the state. The total state sector workforce amounts to 1.4 million employees, which resulted in 86% of the government's tax revenue in 2021 going to paying the salaries of state sector employees. To make matters worse, a staggering 71% of government revenue goes to paying the interest on Sri Lanka's sovereign debts. Paying the salaries of state sector employees and interest costs alone result in a large fiscal deficit, which is managed by more borrowing. Sri Lanka has one of the highest tariff rates in the region, protecting many of its industries. This has led to many large companies in protected industries having less incentive to innovate as they are comfortable in selling in the local market. But being less innovative and competitive also meant that they could not export globally. Import restrictions, tariff barriers, and a lack of free trade agreements — Sri Lanka only has 3 FTAs — has led to Sri Lanka being left out of many global supply chains. Sri Lanka had been self-sufficient in rice production, with imports limited to specialty rice such as basmati. In April 2021, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa announced that Sri Lanka would only allow organic farming, banning inorganic fertilizers and agrochemicals-based fertilizers. The drop in tea production resulting from the fertilizer ban alone resulted in economic losses of around $425 million and created a 20% drop in rice production within the first 6 months alone, reversing previously achieved self-sufficiency in rice production and forcing the country to import rice for $450 million. The situation in the tea industry was described as critical, with farming under the organic program being described as 10 times more expensive and producing half of the yield by the farmers. The program was welcomed by its advisor, Vandana Shiva, but it ignored criticism from the scientific and farming communities who warned about the possible collapse of farming, including a financial crisis due to the devaluation of national currency, which pivoted around the tea industry. Many of the protesters, as well as policy experts, blamed government corruption in part for Sri Lanka's economic crisis. 3 bills to address corruption were developed under the Sirisena administration between 2015 and 2019, when President Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister, but have never been made public. One, described as a composite anti-corruption and bribery law, is based on a 2019 National Action Plan that followed extensive consultations. Another, to deal with proceeds of crime and asset recovery, was developed in 2018. And a third relates to the declaration of assets by public officials. Lastly, Since the mid-1990s, Sri Lanka's tax revenue to GDP ratio has dropped significantly. In 1990, the ratio was nearly 20%, which paralleled those of many developed countries. The tax to GDP ratio was down to 12% in 2019, and after the tax cuts, it has dropped to just above 8%, one of the lowest levels in the world. To make things worse, direct taxes contribute to less than 2% of GDP, and only 1% of the population comes under the income tax base. Many experts compared Lebanon's economic situation with that of Sri Lanka, and had warned that Sri Lanka, too, was on the way to defaulting on its sovereign bonds. Both nations had similar issues, including deep economic crises occurring after their successive governments piled up unsustainable debts following the end of civil wars. Bonus fact. Thank you for staying, lovely viewers. It's now time for the promised bonus fact. With supply shortage throughout Sri Lanka, print media has been negatively affected as well. The dailies, The Island, and Divayana stopped print publication due to paper shortages and related price escalation and switched to e-papers. Question: what do you think about Sri Lanka's economic collapse? Comment down below and let us know your thoughts. If you enjoyed the content, uplift the channel by hitting like, subscribe, and ring the YouTube bell to meet us again in the next video. Until next time.